Students of Reddit, what was the reason for why one of your teachers had a breakdown during class? Teacher hit and killed a student walking on their way to school. I feel legitimately bad about causing this one. Junior year of high school, my lit teacher was from Wisconsin and had a very thick Midwestern accent. This was in the South, so a number of her intonations were very noticeable. In particular, words with an ag syllable stuck out. Egg. Bag would be pronounced like a mixture of bay and egg. She was reading a passage from Beowulf to the class one day, and to paraphrase the modern English translation, came across the following sentence. Beowulf killed the dragon with a dagger. It was too many Midwestern syllables too close together for my friend and I to handle tactfully in our 16-year-old mincits, and involuntarily, we laughed. Upon attempting to cover it up, it probably sounded more like a snicker, and she did not take it well. I wish I could say that she scolded us, but it was so much worse than that. She shut the book, looked at the floor and straight up cried for what must have been 45 seconds, but felt like an entire 45 minutes. Dejected, breathless sobs. Once she had recovered from this, she picked it back up where she left off, like it hadn't happened. Even though, generally speaking, I really disliked that teacher, it sucked knowing that our immature reaction caused her to feel ridiculed. We didn't have malicious intent, but the result was the same, and we of course apologized to her privately after the fact. My math professor in college was going through a divorce and they were fighting for custody of their two younger children. You can tell he was irritated because he wore his emotions on his sleeve. One day he came into class about 5 minutes late, and he was physically shaking. He was violently crying, and apologized to us, and said the class was cancelled. He apparently lost the custody fight with his ex-wife. One time in math class the emo girl was not having it. I don't even remember how it got started, but she ended up bickering with the teacher and the emo girl called the teacher Thundertits. It was at this point that the emo girl was sent to the office and the teacher had to take a seat at her desk in the back for a few minutes. I have a story for this one. A few years ago, I took a class in design theory. It was the pet project of the head of the college, and taught the design principles behind everything from common household objects, to room layouts to entire organizations. It was an absolutely brutal class, but uniquely informative. One day, towards the end of the semester, we went over the use of humor in design. The professor spent the entire class talking about how laughter and amusement can be used to engage an audience, and change how people see a situation. The whole time, he was laughing, cracking jokes, and good ones, too, and generally making sure the class had a good time. And at the end of the lesson, he told us not to underestimate the power of laughter. After all, it was how he had gotten through the lecture that day. His father had died a couple days prior. He broke down crying after he told us. It's probably the most impactful lecture I've ever attended. My university physics professor got the call that his dog had died right before a test. Needless to say, we didn't have a test that day. We'll call him Mr. Jiggles. Of course, that's not his real name. It's not anyone's real name, but it's fitting enough, as he was a rather large fella. A nice man all the same, just rotund. Now, I heard he was on PCP, I heard he was infected by devils, I heard all manner of rumors, but from the mouth of Mr. Jiggles, none of that was true. See, one day in the middle of class he just stopped giving a lecture and somehow became stricken with the idea that he was Jesus. I'm actually not making this up. It does sound like bullshit, even writing this, but I assure you it happened. 1998 was the year, to be exact. He left the classroom and stood in the hallway waiting for class change, and then picked students to bless. He'd walk up, bless a student, and then walk away, all the while preaching loudly that he was the coming of Christ. I'm not sure if it was a second coming in his mind. Who knows? Maybe it was the first. That was unclear. But one of the students wasn't receptive to his blessing, and swatted at Mr. Jiggles' hand. Mistake. Mr. Jiggles grabbed him by the throat and dragged him down the hallway, promising to personally carry him into hell. He actually just carried him into a biology teacher's classroom. She tried to talk him down, but it wasn't working. The police and EMS arrived quickly enough. No one was hurt. Now, I think everyone assumed Mr. Jiggles was fired, but the next year he was back. Everyone had a version of the story and a theory for why it happened. Some say his wife was cheating on him. Others said it was some drug-induced psychosis. But one day at lunch we were talking about something unrelated, and I just asked him point blank what happened. The answer? He was on some kind of psych meds, had run out, and forgot to refill them before hitting empty. His pharmacy was out of that particular medicine, told him it would be 5 days before they got it in, and he thought he'd be fine for that 5 days. He was mistaken. Grade 10 science class, we were taking turns using some kind of lung capacity measuring device. Breathe into a tube and a small plastic bowl gets raised by the force of your breathing. Something gets measured somehow. I can't really remember details aside from the plastic bowl. Anyway, the teacher takes his turn, apparently trying to show off with how hard he can breathe out, somehow breaks the measuring device. The teacher goes into a rage. After realizing he broke it, briefly tries to fix it, gives up, picks up a metal garbage can, and throws it in anger, storms out of the room, and doesn't come back for 10 to 15 minutes, at which point he returns and acts like nothing happened. It was more bizarre and amusing than anything else. My history/government teacher has been to Vietnam, and it's quite known that he was on the front lines. So in the middle of a lecture a girl raised her hand and asked, "Have you ever killed someone?" The question caused him to go silent and leave the room for quite a while. Luckily the girl was ripped a new asshole by her fellow classmates. Not my teacher, but my younger sisters at the time. The class was making fun of her recent miscarriage and her mum dying of cancer. Yes, teenagers are cruel. Physics teacher came into class late, walked past the podium, and walked into the chalkboard. Like, he would have kept walking if it wasn't there. He then picked up one of those plastic pen things that you put chalk in. Proceeded to try and write on the chalkboard, even though the pen was empty of chalk, all the while mumbling incoherently. Found out later he had a stroke and managed to drive himself to the university. Edit, he didn't return to teaching that year, and as best I recall he ended up retiring due to health complications. He was in his 60s, and along with the stroke he had fallen and hit his head. Online searching shows he passed away about 8 years later. My JH biology teacher legit used to have weird ass flashbacks of when he fought at Vietnam. Shit was pretty sad to see. My favorite science teacher in high school was slowly being forced out by administration. One day in class she stopped teaching and sat down in front of us and told us she had just been diagnosed with manuscript and began sobbing. The entire class got up and gave her a long group hug. It is one of my most cherished memories from that chapter of my life. Some guy came in late and started talking to his friends. The teacher chimed in with something like, "If you're gonna be late, you might as well not show up at all." So he said fine, bitch, and left. She stared blankly at the door for a good 30 seconds, and then yelled at everyone else in the class for what one, now absent, student did. I distinctly remember her claiming at one point that everyone in this room is failing this class. A fucktard said head piss on the teacher's grandpa's grave. He HD died 2 days earlier. The one that sticks out is my history teacher, who was a level 10 incompetent at anything. She usually blathered on through class about stupid things. She was always very well put together, dressed well, hair done, it's just there was no substance to her teaching or conversational topics. One day, she started talking about a coworker she was very close to when she was young. Mind you, she had to be approaching her 60s. The story started out innocent enough where we were all basically ignoring her, and pretty soon it veered off into this terrible reality. Her coworker had gone home from work and died in a car accident on the way home. This had to have been 30 years ago. She was crying, saying how much she missed her and how crazy life can be. The way she explained the story was so sad too. They had made plans the following day, and my teacher was excitedly waiting for that coworker to come in. I disliked that teacher immensely, but I felt so sorry for her. She stood there, crying because her friend was gone. I don't think at 15 I could imagine that sort of loneliness or pain. But now, a good 15 years later, I've had her experiences, and I sympathize with her. My 8th grade Spanish teacher and the freshman baseball coach were having an affair. It eventually became public knowledge, and she had several breakdowns as her divorce played out over course of my 8th grade year. I had the pleasure of joining the freshman baseball team the next year, and experiencing his own share of breakdowns from his own divorce. Couple of students were arguing across the classroom. One of them thought he'd be clever and tell the other to go and hang yourself. Teacher ran out of the room crying, came back in 5 minutes later screaming at him that her dad had hung himself, called him a horrible boy, etc. She fucking quit. Like, that week. Everyone kind of jumped him after class. Perhaps a bit far, but I think somewhat deserved. Edit. Okay, clearly jumped was the wrong choice of words here, as a lot of you seem to think he got beat up. He didn't get beaten up. He got surrounded by a group of guys his age, mostly friends of his, and got verbally berated for being a little shit and upsetting the teacher like that. He took a punch to the arm or two, maybe a kick to the calf, but it wasn't anything serious. It was unmistakably the moment that his peers told him that he was out of line. Nobody attacked him. She was a substitute teacher at elementary school, and at some point a kid took it too far and threw a bottle at her. It was an empty plastic bottle, but still, poor teacher. This teacher always seemed tough as nails, so it was a shock when a kid just said she looked like a pit bull. She did have jowls, and she left crying. We made our English teacher cry, but we didn't want to, because we really liked her. She was about to switch to another school, and she had some really important things to do. She needed to call someone, so she gave us a task to do, and left the room for like 5 minutes. We were a horrible class, around 16/17 at this time, at mainly boys. We had breakfast together that day and stuff was still in the classroom. So the boys decided it was time to throw it around and hit the window with sticker butter, while one boy tried to clean the window using a squeegee. Is that the right word? Never used it before, and I'm not native. Someone else decided to throw out the trash. Another teacher came because she saw the trash flying by the window of her classroom, and in the moment she started yelling at us, the other teacher came back. She immediately started crying as she saw what was going on. I think she was angry and overwhelmed because she liked the school and didn't want to leave, but in this moment we were the little assholes making the decision easier. But the next week, she came into the class and had written a small poem for us about being too old to throw around trash and playing with butter. There was this science teacher already on the verge of a breakdown. We called her Molecule. Someone wrote that on a leaf of one of the plants in the class and she started crying and pretty much had a breakdown. This one cool guy, let's call him Dave, tormented our English teacher for no reason. She was very sweet and passionate about her job, but this guy was a dick. He would write things on the board before class really small in random spots like witch, pig and just other random insults. The one day that caused the breakdown was when he stole the remote for the wall-mounted TV. Her class was the time period that had the daily announcements, so the TV was heavily used. So she searched for the remote, couldn't find it, and had to stand on her tiptoes to control the TV from the button on the front. A little bit through the announcements the TV turns off. Everyone's reaction was weird, so teacher got back up to turn the TV on again. A minute or so later went off again. Of course at that point it starts getting suspicious, and she jokes, okay, is someone playing a prank on me? No one says anything, because no one knew Dave had the remote. He repeats turning it off 2 more times directly after she turned it back on and she snapped. Okay, who has the remote, who is doing this? And being immature 9th graders we all start snickering, cause that shit's funny. After no one fessed up she starts unloading about how she been having a tough time lately and starts spewing out all this information about her personal life, just ranting away. And during the middle of her rant Dave turns the TV on and starts flipping through the channels. The teacher lets out her animalistic yell and burst into tears. Cue entire class with shocked Pikachu face. She throws the classroom door open and runs out. She was gone for like 20 minutes and returns with the JROTC teacher. Literal hard as steel drill sergeant. He was calmly talking to us how what we were doing as a class was shitty to her, and the perp needs to step forward, and fucking Dave had the balls to turn the TV off and on. Dead silence. You could have heard dust falling on the ground and everyone was like, we're dead. At this point someone who knew he took it quietly pointed at Dave. The drill instructor goes over to him and literally pulls him up out of his desk by his shirt collar and screams in his face, "Do you have a fucking remote?" Feet dangling off of the ground. His whole arm was shaking as he took the remote out of his pocket and showed it. His ass was grass now. He was swiftly removed from the class by the drill instructor and teacher, while we all sat there for the rest of the class doing nothing until the bell rang.